The most surprising discovery about mental exhaustion is that it hardly ever happens because life is technically, objectively unbearable. Exhaustion, technically, in our lives is functioning. For example, we answer all our emails, we complete all our conversations in a polite manner, and our calendar is also full to look productive or to just cope with life. And yet, underneath all of this intense functioning sits a mind that has been absorbing input all week without any clear boundary, where processing needs to stop and recovery needs to begin. Modern life places the brain inside a constant stream of information. Messages do appear on our phones constantly. We tend to have constant conversations with people. We have to cope up with the world by reading all these articles and update ourselves. Neuroscientists sometimes describe attention as a finite cognitive resource. Each small shift of focus carries a cost, and the brain subtly accumulates fatigue when those shifts happen 100 times a day. When we look at our weekend time, our weekend time is supposed to repair this fatigue. Yet, a lot of people discover the opposite. Our weekends are filled with errands, and Sundays are filled with social obligations or digital wandering that feels somehow restful in the moment but leaves the mind more agitated by evening, remains in the same mode it occupied during the week. So, a more useful weekend often begins when small rituals interrupt that pattern. These do not need to be elaborate and should not turn into productivity systems. They should not look aesthetic by any means, but they need to be repeatable. Activities that gently return attention to slower rhythms. Over time, these rituals become psychological signals that our mind can somehow, in some way, cope up with. So, I have a list of some practices that have emerged gradually through trial and error, each one offering a slightly different form of relief from the mental overstimulation that modern schedules like ours produce. The first one is taking a long walk without audio. Walking while listening to podcasts or music feels productive, yet the brain remains inside a stream of input. An occasional walk without headphones changes the entire texture of the experience, and attention begins drifting outward slowly towards ordinary sensory details. For example, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement and the fragments of conversations from passing strangers and the beautiful way the sunlight probably lands differently on the top of buildings around you at different times of the day. So, psychologists studying this have found that the kind of unstructured mental wandering allows the brain to process information accumulated earlier. Ideas begin rearranging themselves without conscious effort, and problems that felt tangled during the week sometimes resolve themselves simply because attention has stopped trying to solve them. So, what actually happens is the walk ends without a very big revelation. Do not expect that. It did not happen to me. Yet the mind tends to feel noticeably less crowded. The second thing is reading a physical book for one uninterrupted hour. This is one of my favorite ones. So, digital reading does not tend to produce the same cognitive experience as sustained reading from a physical page. This is because notifications obviously interrupt our conversation, hyperlinks tend to invite attention to scatter. The mind may also be aware of the other information that is just one tab away. For example, doom scrolling. So, a single uninterrupted hour with the printed book produces a different mental rhythm and slows you down. Cognitive researchers have shown that deep reading activates networks related to empathy, memory, integration, and narrative imagination, which is amazing. The brain settles into one sustained thread of thought rather than jumping across fragments. By the end of the hour, what you're going to feel is that your attention will feel steadier as the mind has reminded how to follow an idea from beginning to end. So, this brings me to a fun third point. Cooking something that requires patience. Weekday meals often exist purely for efficiency. And food is something we eat quickly, it's eaten between tasks, and we barely notice it. But on weekends, cooking creates a different atmosphere at home when the process itself becomes the point. So prepare a meal that involves chopping vegetables slowly, stir a sauce that thickens over time, or knead a dough that introduces an unusual rhythm into the day. What happens here is our hands remain occupied with a tangible task while the mind is free to drift wherever it wants freely. Anthropologists often describe cooking as one of the oldest forms of human grounding behavior because it engages multiple senses simultaneously. And the result is not merely just a dinner, but a small period of mental recalibration. The fourth thing is resetting one corner of the living space. Large cleaning projects can feel exhausting, yet restoring order to pro- single surface produces a surprisingly emotional shift. A cluttered desk, kitchen counter that is crowded with small objects, maybe just your nightstand that has gradually accumulated books and cables and it's a little disorganized. Choosing one of these spaces and resetting it fully takes less time than expected. I read about this where environmental psychology research has consistently linked physical order with reduced cognitive load. Visual clutter occupies our attention even when it is no longer consciously noticed. Removing it frees mental space in ways that we don't usually notice. The room does not change and get a makeover, yet the environment begins cooperating with the mind rather than competing with it. The fifth thing is writing down the week that just happened. Journaling often becomes associated with emotional processing or self analysis. However, a simpler practice can be more effective for an overstimulated brain. So consider documenting the events of the past week in just a straightforward language like you would be talking to a friend. Which conversations stood out to you or which tasks felt closer to you and your identity? So, psychologists studying expressive writing have found that describing experience helps the brain organize memory and emotional context. The process resembles filing loose papers into labeled folders. Once recorded, the event stops circulating endlessly in working memory. How it reflects in your week is you would probably start feeling finished rather than unfinished. The sixth thing is a technology free morning window. Phones hardly ever remain idle for long once the day begins. Messages are being notified, we have a lot of news to check, and our attention enters into a reactive state before the breakfast is finished. So consider setting aside even 2 hours of the morning without opening digital feeds. This creates a noticeable shift in mood. It slows you down in a really good way. Activities that fill this window can remain very ordinary. My personal favorite is reading, but you can try stretching, preparing your coffee, writing notes for the day, because what's going to matter is the absence of external input. Attention usually begins the day oriented inward rather than outward. That difference changes the tone of everything that follows during that particular day. Next thing is visiting a familiar place that requires no decisions, like cafes, parks, bookstores, or walking routes that have been visited many times. This carries a psychological comfort because no decisions are technically required about where to sit, what to do, or how this environment works. The mind tends to relax because the setting has already been mapped. Environmental familiarity reduces cognitive effort in ways researchers describe as decision fatigue reduction. With fewer choices to manage, attention becomes available for reflection or observation. So, returning to the same place repeatedly turns the environment into a small sanctuary from constant novelty. Allowing one completely unstructured afternoon is something that helps me time and again when I'm overstimulated. Productivity culture often treats unstructured time as wasteful. In reality, the brain frequently needs periods where no outcome is required. So, think of an afternoon without plans. They may tend to begin awkwardly because the impulse to check messages is going to occur repeatedly. Eventually, your attention begins exploring possibilities on its own. So, you probably would end up rearranging a room, sketching ideas, calling a friend you haven't spoken to in a while, or probably taking another walk. Creativity is said that it often notes and generates new ideas that do not emerge in tightly scheduled environments. And mental spaciousness allows connection to appear that structured activity does not tend to produce very often. Talk to someone who understands your inner life. Certain conversations feel restorative because explanation is unnecessary. A friend who knows the background of ongoing projects, a partner, your boyfriend, husband, wife, girlfriend, familiar with recent stresses, or probably your colleague who understands the intellectual problems of currently that are currently occupying the mind at workplace. These conversations do not require so much translation because it's said that emotionally attuned conversations reduce stress hormones and activate neural pathways that is associated with trust and safety. So the effect essentially resembles releasing mental pressure that has been slowly been building during the week. Afterward, the mind feels lighter even though there is no concrete problem that was solved. The last thing is ending your Sunday with intentional anticipation. Many people approach Sunday evening with a vague sense of dread about the upcoming week. A small ritual can alter this transition. Write down one thing that is worth looking forward to in your coming week or in the coming days. And no, the event does not have to be very extraordinary. It could just be a lunch with your colleague, a chapter of a book that you've been meaning to read, or maybe a workout planned with a friend of yours. Studies show that anticipation have found that positive expectation activates reward circuits in the brain before the event actually happens. The week begins with a small thread of curiosity rather than resistance. So, the real purpose of weekend rituals is that they do not tend to eliminate stress permanently, like nothing does, because your work is constantly going to be pressurizing and ask a lot of from you. Schedules are usually crowded. Modern life continues to deliver more information than the brain is evolved to process. But these rituals are going to give you a certain sense of rhythm to signal to your mind that attention can occasionally move at a slower pace. And they create moments where the brain stops reacting and begins observing again. Overstimulated mind does not need massive lifestyle changes. It needs recurring spaces where nothing is demanding immediate response. And these weekend rituals create those spaces. And once your brain remembers how that rhythm feels and returning to it becomes easier each week. So if you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean so much to me. I also write essays on my Substack. I'm going to link everything down below. And thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one.